Welcome to On Defense and Security, a podcast that examines domestic and international defense and military affairs. Through conversations, we will bridge the gap between academic research and policy and provide a platform for informed discussions, enabling our listeners to better understand critical issues.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the On Defense and Security podcast, a podcast series that examines defense and military affairs, both in Canada and internationally. I wanted to kind of bring in a bunch of people to talk about something that's all the rage right now, which is basically artificial intelligence and generative AI and what that means for conflict, war, terrorism, extremism. And so I've asked Yannick Veilleux-Lepage from the Royal Military College and David Wells to come in. We'll maybe start with quick introductions from both of you, and then we'll go into it. Who wants to go first?
I can jump in. So yeah, I'm David Wells. I've been working in counterterrorism and PCV for the last 20 years or so as a practitioner, researcher, and policymaker. I'm currently an independent consultant working with a bunch of different governments and at the international, regional, and national level to try and understand some of the challenges, particularly relating to new technology and AI in the security space.
Yeah, and I'm Yannick Veilleux-Lepage. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the Royal Military College. I'm also a fellow of the CIDP. My work broadly looks at terrorist tactical innovation, terrorist learning, and particularly the use of emerging technology by non-state actors. That's include a lot of work on terrorist use of drones, terrorist use of 3D printers, particularly 3D printed firearm, and more this use of generative AI and how this is changing terrorist operation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks both of you for joining. Maybe we'll start with David. When we talk about AI, kind of in this space, what strikes you in terms of what we're actually talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think anybody does any work on AI for any length of time runs immediately into this definitional question, because I think we're very much in a space where every tool that you interact with is promoting AI in every possible way. I think most of what we're talking about in terms of the recent shifts and the recent interest is about generative AI. So we're talking about large language models, on the whole, things like chatbots, obviously more recently agentic AI as well. But obviously we probably should say there's a long-standing use of other sorts of AI, like machine learning, particularly in using big data and CT and counterterrorism, but also other areas of security as well. So I think, definitional stuff's always really important, but I think a lot of what the world is generally talking about right now is generative AI.
Is there anything you want to add, Yannick, to that, or? Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think that's a good introduction. I think it's a good baseline for us to work with.
Yeah. This is a space I think that always, there's a bit of, I guess, ambulance chasing that's involved in this space in terms of whether it's social media and the internet during the ISIS days or the new concerns around the far right. Is this kind of following a familiar pattern of in terms of us overreacting to some of this technological innovation, or do you actually see this as something fundamentally different?
So
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, go.
No, please go.
So I was going to say, violent actors have always absorbed new technologies, right?
Yeah.
And there's a fantastic paper that was written about a decade ago by Isabel Duvenstein, and she makes essentially the argument that if we kind of look at, there's this whole body of literature that talks about how like dynamite changed the nature of terrorism and ushered in this new wave of terrorism. And essentially she makes the argument like, yeah, sure, dynamite provided terrorists with new tools, but dynamite didn't just change terrorism, it changed all aspect of human life and social existence. It allowed us to build skyscrapers, it allowed us to build highways, railroads, it changed the way we do mining and agriculture and whatnot. And I think we can kind of make similar arguments here, right? Same argument can be made about transnational networks, about mass media, about the internet, and particularly about AI, right? So when there's a consequential technology like AI, it's going to be adopted across the board. And that includes being adopted by bad actors. So I think the baseline assumption here should always be that like if a technology is transformative enough, it's going to find its way into extremist practice. So the question is never whether, it's more kind of how and how fast. And I think really AI fits this pattern in a couple of ways. But last year, Don Razda and I at CTC, we essentially published this framework where we tried to kind of ask ourselves, like, what are the factors that all the technologies that are being adopted by non-state actors share? We came up with four, right? This notion that they're disruptive. They have the potential to transform entire field. AI does that. They're dual use, right? They have the capability to serve legitimate kind of like pro-social purposes, but they can also turn toward harms. AI fits that box, right? They're democratized. The barriers are dropped to the point where individuals, not just big organizations, can have access to this. And, ChatGPT account, $20 within access to most people, and you didn't have free versions of it, right? So definitely hitting that thing. And then lastly, this notion that they're diffuse, right? They spread across the spectrum broadly, and they move so quickly that containment becomes essentially impossible. So I would say, like, for me, what we're seeing is not new in the sense that we have historical framework to see this, but how they're going to be used and how fast they're being used does present perhaps a novel challenge.
David?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think sometimes, there can be a degree of panic and insecurity writ large when a new technology comes onto the scene of like, we've never faced anything like this before. We don't know what we're doing. And I think that's definitely was the case when generative AI really burst onto the scene. And it's very easy to quickly extrapolate to some really hyperbolic or kind of far-fetched scenarios that are technically possible or might technically be possible in the future. I think this is something that the AI industry encourages because they're always promoting these kind of far-reaching visions and selling a kind of future that may or may not happen, and really not wanting people to focus on the actual day-to-day harms these tools are already causing here and now. I think it's an interesting comparison with social media because I think we all worked in that period where, yes, ISIS were kind of taking advantage of social media and the big platforms were kind of brought to the table kicking and screaming, and only really when it got undeniable were they able to take action or willing to take meaningful action. I think the difference is here maybe that these tools are being pushed out so quickly with new models coming out all of the time without meaningful safety tests being done, without meaningful red teaming happening, and it's kind of reverse engineering. Lots of people are experiencing AI psychosis, self-harm, and other things are happening. Maybe we'll put in some features. And so I think the speed with which they're rolling out new features, new models, becoming more advanced, and these harms are kind of apparent but are not really being responded to. And I think the kind of lax regulatory environment they're landing in particular in the US, maybe does make it slightly different. And I guess maybe the speed of adoption thing is the other thing that makes it so different. If we're already looking at hundreds of millions of regularly users, albeit a lot of those are only using free services in a relatively limited way. I think we're looking at something that's just happened so much more quickly than the kind of gradual rollout of social media and slightly new platforms emerging, that kind of thing.
And I think with social media, they were brought kicking and screaming to the regulation table when you can just go on Twitter and find beheading videos. But we are dealing with a different landscape with the Trump administration and with people like Zuckerberg and Musk basically saying we're not going this route anymore, right? And so it's into this new kind of libertarian. It's not particularly new, but this kind of resurrected libertarian culture that these platforms are now arriving in. What do you think society kind of, or I guess CT practitioners, extremism researchers are kind of getting wrong about what's on the horizon in terms of AI and security? Or maybe more personally, what worries you most about what's on the horizon?
I took the last one. David, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much that people are getting things wrong. I think there's an understandable focus, like I said, on kind of far-reaching concerns like CBRN, for example. Like obviously, terrorists getting access to crafted, designed, tailored biological weapons is something that nobody wants to happen. But I think we're jumping through so many steps, right? Drones is a really good example, and Yannick's obviously done so much great work on that space that we can go from the kind of current usage rate, which is still relatively limited in terms of weaponization outside of kind of state adjacent actors, and go straight to, we need to be worried about AI-driven swarms of drones releasing chemical weapons into crowds. It's not that that isn't a concern, but it feels like there's a lot of capability steps that still need to be jumped through before we get there. So I think I'm probably less worried about some of those really apocalyptic use cases. I'm more worried about the kind of wider societal impacts of AI. And so this is one of the things I really argued in a couple of my papers, that we should be worried about terrorist misuse, because as Yannick clearly set out, that they are going to use it. They are currently using these tools, and they can optimize some of the things they're doing. They could potentially lead to new things. But I think it's that wider societal impacts on economies, for example, and that can go either, the bubble bursts and everyone loses their jobs, or the kind of things that we're seeing already where AI is enabling companies to lay off large amounts of people. So I think the information environment being polluted with AI deepfakes and AI information is a terrible thing for society, but it also creates an environment in which extremism can flourish. And so for me, the kind of terrorism is almost like a second order area which we do need to be worried about. But it's all of those broader things that we're also seeing with kind of further monopolization of power and the ability to shape truth and shape narratives and put your finger on the scale to direct things politically, that I think is the more worrying thing. But again, it does all connect back to terrorism and violent extremism as well.
Yeah, that resonates with me as well, right? I think kind of there's a lot of focus that's being put on this notion of, the deep fake, the AI generated propaganda, the state recruitment messages and all that. And I'm like, okay, yes, that is a problem. But it's also a problem that in some ways is kind of like, it's the easiest one to address, right? And the answer here is content moderation and platform moderation and content detection. So we focused on this because the tech companies are also, they're acknowledging that problem and they're offering it the solution as part of the same package. Well, we've got this new model. We've got these new terms and services. So don't worry about this. I think there's also this kind of like the other extreme, right? This notion of AI as the autonomous terrorist planner, the designer who's going to run operation on its own. And we can talk about this in maybe more detail a bit later on. But I think that again pulls attention from what's happening under our eyes right now, which is AI as essentially a source of grievances. And there's really different ways that we can think about this, but we can take AI and kind of map it along the ideological spectrum and see how various group and actors could essentially be further radicalized or could shift their focus because of AI. So we're talking, if some of the anthropic prophecies come to bear, right? We're talking about people losing their jobs. We're talking about entire skill sets becoming obsolete. We're talking about communities feeling like technology is being done to them rather than being done for them. Well, that's not a manufactured grievance, right? Like that creates real life grievance that can then be transposed into real violence, right? Like we often, to do the historical thing, we often think of the Luddites as being these people. We use the term Luddite as like this rejection of technology, right? These people destroyed these machines because they were against modernity. But that's not the reality of it, right? Like the textile manufacturers in the 1800s were skilled workers, and their move towards violence against the automatic loom wasn't because they had this visceral reaction to automation. It's because it was a direct threat to their livelihood. We can start seeing about like the environmental drain, right? And you can map this both on the far right and the far left as a place, as a mechanism that can fuel grievances. When you're talking about like societal harm, right? Like people who have family members who experience psychosis, who engage in self-harm, who end up taking their own lives because of these kind of prosocial relationship with AI. All these people are going to have real life grievances, and some of them may choose to act on them through violence. So this is like, to me, this is the part that kind of worries me a bit, and this is also kind of the part where at times just AI companies and be like, yeah, continue investing in the content moderation and all that, but also start investing in physical security for your employee, for your CEO, for your infrastructures, because eventually, the duck's going to come home to roost, and you are going to end up being targeted by some of this violence.
You're saying that AI companies are going to create a situation in which they become seen as enemies of kind of social well-being?
I think if what they are essentially projecting, right, this
Mm.
whole change of economic and social system comes to bear fruit, that societal change isn't going to happen without opposition.
And I think it's interesting when they've talked about those scenarios, there's no meaningful conversation about what societies or economies should do. People mention UBI occasionally as like they're throwing it out there, but really what they're talking about is a further, grab of wealth and power from a select few. And like you say, history tells us that generally doesn't go smoothly. So, and I think even with some of the environmental stuff, it's, we've seen with data centers in particular, they're incredibly unpopular at a local level. They're obviously using fossil fuels to power them. They're polluting. All these sorts of things which are incredibly unpopular. So I think at the moment, the attitude certainly of the American AI companies is kind of, we have the power to do these things, astronomical sums for all these different projects, complete alignment with the administration. But I think almost the lack of friction, the lack of opposition is, to your point, Yannick, making them more confident in their own kind of potential security long term, and then making these kind of pronouncements without really thinking about, well, what does that mean for society when we're breaking that kind of bond of there are people who have secure jobs doing things that are meaningful and interesting. If you replace all of that with a machine, what does that look like for society moving forward?
And David, are you noticing any regulatory pushback on the European side? Because I mean, on the US side, it's kind of just keep your head down and move forward, or break things and ask questions later. But what's the European pushback looking like?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the AI Act was like the first off the docket really in terms of regulation, and I think understandably we've seen quite a lot of pushback from the tech industry. There have been some delays in terms of implementation and some rolling back and watering down, and I think this is maybe the other thing about AI in this current moment, that there's such close alignment with a particular administration as being so aggressive in all senses of the word, but certainly in terms of tariffs and trade talks, is that this is being, in the same way that content moderation is being packaged together as a sort of anti-American approach. So I think there is reluctance in the EU in terms of fully implementing the AI Act, and I think in terms of meaningful penalties, because we've seen that monopolization of a few big companies, and maybe that'll be whittled down even further if current economic trends continue over the next few months. It's hard, right? You're trying to meaningfully regulate an industry that is so closely tied to an administration that is very aggressive in its trade stance in particular. I think maybe the child safety angle, and this is certainly seems to be what's happening in the US at least, is that even though there's no desire from the administration and from GOP to meaningfully regulate AI companies and a huge amount of funding going into super PACs and other things, that maybe the child safety angle is the one in which it's kind of hard to argue that these tools should be allowed to exist in their current state and have kids and teens engaging with them and going down all sorts of harmful pathways. So I think to broaden it out, maybe there is a potentially a pathway on the kind of harder security side to not piggyback that movement, because it's important in and of its own right. But I certainly think in terms of some of the chatbot risks, going back to your previous question, I think that's one of the things that really concerns me most, because we've seen these parasocial relationships develop, we've seen the harms that they've caused, and we're just in uncharted territory here. We don't really know what the long-term impacts of farming out your work relationships, your personal relationships, your mental health relationships, all of this kind of community is being, it's essentially farmed out to one chatbot that can remember you and is sycophantic and all these sorts of things. So I think, the chatbot thing is a real concern for me, just because, well, all of those things, but also the lack of visibility. Social media was bad and it's getting worse again, but at least there's a degree of researchers, policy people can see what's happening, see what the trends are, but we just don't know what those trends are. And maybe we'll come on to the shooting in Canada a few weeks ago, but that lack of visibility for anyone to really see the direction of travel is obviously a huge concern, I think.
On that point, right? I do think the child safety angle is definitely a very useful one to look at. And I do share some kind of cautious optimism with that. But I would also caveat it with the fact that it took us, 10, 15 years before we started seeing like meaningful regulation effort to protect children from social media and social media related harms, right? So there's the obvious stuff that came out very quickly about the production and distribution of CSAM. But as far as like all the second order of effect harms, we're only now seeing countries putting, like minimum age for social media or classroom bans on cell phones and things like that. There's now this recognition, both from parents, but also from children, that there's like a distinct harm that came with this kind of unrestricted consumption of social media. But that took us, what Facebook came out in 2006 and we're in 2020. It took us 20 years before,
Yeah.
regulatory and also political appetite was there. And I hope that we will have learned from that, but I fear that we haven't.
No, I mean, looking at Canada's kind of online arms legislation that is being discussed now, it is the child safety angle that they put front and center because that's the only one that kind of bypasses the freedom of speech conversation that tends to happen as a pushback to any sort of regulation. But when you talk about child safety and very young people on these platforms, it's hard to kind of be against that, right? And especially you throw in CSAM and these things. What's interesting I've noticed recently is also a pushback from some students in the classroom to the kind of uncertainty. I think Yannick was kind of touching on this, like the kind of uncertainty of whether you can trust the information out that's being presented to them on these platforms, on these chatbots, is actually getting them to swing the pendulum to the other direction, which is like, I want to now like I increase my commitment to fact-based information. I want teachers around me and the universities to tell me like what's actually happening because they feel like they're in this information space where nothing makes sense and everything could be true. And so I think, and that happened very quickly, right? If you think about how young ChatGPT is and other platforms. So the long-term consequences seem to be that there might actually be a doubling down on, let's go back to a fact-based society where I can actually trust information that I'm seeing. And that might, in a weird way, double the trust in things like the university system, right? Whereas now you're actually in a situation where you're talking to human beings and can know that something being told to you is actually correct. Because I don't get the impression that people like being in this space of complete uncertainty and complete everything could be true and complete subjectivity. It's kind of destabilizing in a way, right? Emotionally. So I mean that could be a kind of interesting thing down the horizon to kind of bring us back to a semblance of reality.
It's an interesting one. I think the age profile thing, because I think the child safety thing is a positive thing, and as you said, in terms of regulation, it's hard to deny. But I think sometimes it can really come across as this is the only context in which this is a problem. And I certainly in terms of social media, and certainly thinking of slightly older demographics, they are have huge issues with recognizing mis and disinformation, conspiracy theories, all of those sorts of things. And I think one thing that AI is really good for is for people who feel lazy or feel overwhelmed. And so not that students can't be both of those things, but I think people who are at later stage in life do have busy jobs, busy family life, are overwhelmed. Like it's a sort of cheat code, right? And I think in some ways, maybe anecdotally, that kind of young people trying to make their way in the world, seeing this incredibly difficult job market and economic environment, and seeing that actually learning properly and studying properly is going to set them apart from some of their peers. It's like a positive thing, but maybe it's millennials and Gen X and beyond who might be more susceptible to some of that environment, because it's just that busy life where people don't have time to kind of fact check or think about things. And anecdotally, again, so some of my peers will maybe not use AI for their own work or areas where they know a lot, but they'll use it for everything else. And you kind of think, well, yeah, the stakes are lower, but also if you don't trust it for something that's important in a professional sense, then why are you trusting it for a bunch of other stuff? So yeah, I don't know. I think the age factor, I think we're just in such uncharted territory in terms of what, in that sense, in terms of what those relationships look like with fact and truth and information sources, and seeing so many people parents just being like, can I feed this thing to my child? I'll just ask ChatGPT. And it's like the stakes were quite high for that, but also you're incredibly busy and you're trying to make a split decision. So I kind of get it.
And I think even, the demographic that's even more at risk here are an older, seniors, the elderly, right? A lot of these technologies are very accessible and the user experience is quite rewarding. Right. So you don't have to type. You can talk to ChatGPT, you can talk to Claude, you can ask it these kind of everyday questions. It also creates, as David said, this kind of parasocial relationship. We know that there's a lot of cases of isolation, of dementia, of memory loss. So all of this makes the tool extremely attractive, both as something that can, create a net benefit in the life of somebody who is isolated, in the life of somebody who has type of, cognitive decline. Um, but this is a population which historically has been taken advantage of as soon as a new kind of digital technology has come out, right? So, you could go back to phone scams, you go back to, romance scams on the internet, and now we're kind of looking at this. And I think this is one of the places where there isn't a lot of conversation as well. We're kind of talking about broader societal harms. I'm more worried about how my parents are going to use ChatGPT and other generative AI platforms than I am about how a 13-year-old is, as far as like the immediate harm to the individual.
I want to, I wasn't, this kind of takes us away from defense and extremism and so on, but I want to read you guys a quote that Sam Altman said recently, the CEO of OpenAI, and I want to kind of get your thoughts on it. He says, quote, "We see a future where intelligence is a utility, like electricity or water, and people buy it from us on a meter." I'm curious what that tells you about how he's thinking about these technologies and what he imagines. And I don't want to just pin it on him, but like what these companies imagine our future to be in terms of their role in it.
I mean, I saw a post on LinkedIn a couple days ago, which might have, maybe it was a contender for the LinkedIn lunatic subreddit, but I actually thought it was interesting. It was a prof in the States essentially saying that younger scholars, when they're negotiating their startup package, rather than negotiating an amount of money for conferences and book and whatnot, they should negotiate an amount of money for tokens for OpenAI, because that's the way of kind of it's going to replace an undergraduate RA and so on. I think, it just shows a kind of broad adoption of this idea of generative AI as a commodity, as a commodity to be consumed. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think to me, what is terrifying with that prospect is that this kind of promise is like the early days of the internet, right? This unfeathered access to the sum of human knowledge at a democratized cost, right? Then whatever the price of an internet connection is being eroded away. So yeah.
I was thinking of that quite actually earlier on before the podcast, because I was really thinking about some of those risks. And I think some of those, one of the largest risks is that laziness, that outsourcing of thinking, outsourcing of writing and decisions to a tool. It sort of makes me think a bit of the movie Wall-E, where you've just got this blobs kind of moving around and on wheelchairs, and they've got so lazy they don't have to make any decisions, that kind of everything's taken care of. And I think for me, it's a really worrying direction of travel, but I think it really speaks to the kind of economic model that they're creating. I mean, let's be real, like none of these companies are anywhere close to making a profit at the moment. And so to your point about that kind of democratized access to knowledge and skills, the only way in which this is in any way profitable is if the prices are hiked up significantly and if advertising is widely integrated across these platforms. So suddenly you go from a model where you can't do your job without this tool, but it's going to cost you more and more to continue to use it, to more and more to have access to materials that you've created in the past. And so for me, it's like that creation of dependency that is really terrifying, because at the moment, everything's free. And I know when people say, oh, it's free, you're the product, but I think the difference is this way, that the ads revenue that you could generate from what you would learn from a person from all of their prompts and discussions with one tool is just staggering. And again, the ability to hyper target services and products, again, is just like compared to like Facebook and what they used to be able to sell ads for, it's just extraordinary. So I think that's the scary model for me, this kind of dependency, and then you suddenly hike the prices up and it becomes something that isn't accessible to everyone, but people have kind of stopped using their brains for so long that it's really hard to regain that skills. And because search is so broken and because it's all Google AI now, like the sum of human knowledge is not necessarily available in one place anymore. So that kind of hyper local stuff, and that's before you start thinking about the kind of political component of what facts and what information is included in training data, how the algorithm gets shifted around to manipulate. So yeah, I think it's such a telling quote in terms of that mindset of, it's going to be the equivalent of a utility that you provide service for. Like that's for me is terrifying as a vision.
And I mean, the framework for this already exists, right? From most softwares that we use, having gone from, you pay for the software, you pay for the license to a subscription model. We're now seeing with vehicles, right? You buy the car, and on top of that, you're now paying subscription to get access to various features of that vehicle. I don't think anybody feels that their life has gone better for the bring about this model. And again, I think this kind of fits into this notion of AI as a potential source of grievance. Eventually, when people start kind of looking around, I mean, like why are things so miserable right now? AI might end up being a fairly easy target to put the blame towards, or at least the AI company or the CEOs, particularly when there's quotes like that floating around.
I mean, they also kind of scoot past the fact that they vacuumed up the entire internet and the 2,000 years of human knowledge, and then are now spitting it back to us and pretending like they never needed us in the first place. And so I think that part of it is a conveniently left out part of the conversation, where it's like we don't need humans anymore to think, but that's because you've stolen everything to begin with.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for my Anthropic settlement check that hasn't arrived yet.
So moving into the extremism and terrorism space, I'm curious what you two have kind of seen in terms of how these actors are already using AI or generative AI, and I mean, very concretely in the sense of what you've already seen happen as opposed to like what you're afraid of, but like how have you seen them already use it up until now?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one because I think propaganda is just the one that's so easy to spot, and so it's hard to not get focused on the one thing that we can kind of measure, or not even really meaningfully measure. There are certain things that are clearly AI in their look or feel or sound, and so that you can identify. And I guess there are other bits of propaganda or content that it's a bit harder to determine whether like AI was used in some part of the process. So I think we've seen a lot of propaganda. I'm still not sure that we've seen a kind of direction of travel that suggests it's going to become the predominant way. Maybe we're slowly moving that direction, but I think it has been striking that it hasn't. Everyone's still talking about ISKP having like an AI news anchor in May 2024. And it's like, well, no one else has done it since. So what does that tell us about how that resonated or how effective that was as a tactic? So I think we've seen a lot of propaganda. I still think, the jury is definitely out on whether that makes propaganda more effective, certainly in terms of the language side. There's an expectation you can reach people you couldn't reach before unless you had language skills. But, AI aesthetics do have a negative impact for some people as well. So I think the jury's out for me on how transformative it will be. I think the other challenges that we've seen, because we've seen a decline in content moderation efforts, the extra volume of the material that's available on Facebook, for example. I don't know if we could say that's because they're creating millions of pieces on AI or just that Meta's not doing its job anymore. So we've seen that. That's really visible. I think on the operational planning side, we've seen a few things, certainly towards the end of last year, where we were suddenly seeing a few court cases in which generative AI was being mentioned, and ChatGPT mainly. But we're a little less certain on exactly how it was used. So we can say, for example, that a car that exploded outside a Trump Hotel in Las Vegas, the individual involved had searched for information about explosives, but we're still not really clear whether that made it a more effective attack or potentially made it less effective. So I think for me, the jury's out on the impact of the AI use. But I think the operational research side, we will just see a lot more of that because people are using AI as search now. And so I think it's not overreacting when that happens. But yeah, I think court cases, we're just going to have a steady stream of, we arrested this teenager in France, and it turns out that he'd used ChatGPT to research this or plan this or ask questions about sourcing a knife or whatever. So we are seeing concrete uses, but I don't know if I would at this stage think it's had a game-changing impact yet. But I think with the chatbot kind of lack of visibility I mentioned, we might be missing it because we just focus on the things we can see on social media and Telegram and that sort of thing.
I see it almost like the gaming scare from a couple of, like, I mean, all the ongoing gaming scare is like, oh, they were on the gaming platform. It's just like they were on ChatGPT, they were on the gaming platform, they were on this other thing, and it's like, well, which one of it, like, is any of it useful? Was it useful, or is it just that they're everywhere, just like everyone else is everywhere?
All 16-year-olds are on gaming platforms. All 16-year-olds are probably using ChatGPT, but what does it mean in terms of, terrorism, violent extremism? Definitely.
Yeah, I think kind of in the early days of these conversations, like 2023 and so on, there's a lot of effort that was made to come up with like typologies, right? Essentially being like, these are all the various threat vectors that we can think of. And I think that's a useful way to start thinking about these things. And I think there's actually very good methodologies to create these typologies. And, generally speaking, they have really focused on like this propaganda, but some of the operational stuff as well. I do think when we kind of look at these typologies, most of the use case are material are being materialized in some way or another. But that's just because generative AI is literally all around us, right? What I think is kind of more interesting as a question is less the use, like what is it not being used for, right? The counterfactual here. Might be more revealing, right? And there's a couple of reasons for this. I think kind of when we build these typologies of document case, we're creating detection bias, right? We're saying these are case and where the activity is visible enough to be caught and studied. So we catalog it and then we say, like in Southport, during the riots, people were creating synthetic videos of migrants acting in a violent way. There's all this kind of Gen AI influencer content. So there's Amelia in the UK that's particularly prominent. But I think what's kind of interesting to me here is like, what are the ways that we're not seeing it? And are we not seeing it because there's friction that exists that makes AI not actually useful or interesting as a technology in order to engage in some task? Or are we not seeing it because there's detection blind spot because it's happening and we're not seeing it? So this is one of the ways that I'm trying to start thinking about this options. If this technology or about this technology is if it's really all encompassing, are there spots where it's curiously absent? And if it is, why is that? And that goes both with actors and with MOs.
Well, I mean, let me follow up with that. I guess, like, where would you expect where were you expecting to see it that you're not seeing it compared to like some of the other innovations that you studied, whether it's drones or 3D printers or what have you? Like, what surprised you about how it's not being used?
So I think a lot of the focus has been on the propaganda side. I think what we're not actually seeing is operational use that wouldn't that is distinct to AI, right? And I guess kind of the example I like to use, right, is we'll often kind of discuss, and this comes out from time to time, about how people are jailbreaking AIs in order to come up with like school shooting scenarios, right? And the kind of the obvious example is there's a PhD student in the US who focuses on school shooting, and he demonstrated how he was able to jailbreak ChatGPT by essentially saying like, my school is going to have a Nerf gun competition or war in my school. So how do I go about winning this? And then it essentially kind of gave it an attack plan. My kind of thinking here is, even if there's an individual who wants to engage in a school shooting, does he actually need to have the interaction with AI in order to get the operational knowledge to engage in a school shooting? Probably not. What ends up probably happening is the sycophantic relationship that's more problematic, right? The fact that it doesn't necessarily shut down that conversation right away, or at the very least, it might redirect the conversation, but it tries to continue in that engagement. So to me, I haven't seen any type of kind of like actualized terrorist scenario where AI is present, that if you remove AI from the equation, the plot kind of crumbles. Um, David, I don't know if you can think of anything as well.
No, I'd agree. Yeah, I think it's for me, it's the value add. And I think one of the challenging things is, you can say AI can lower the barrier to entry because you can ask those questions in an environment and build up a relationship around those discussions. And that's obviously a bit harder to prove. But yeah, I think for me, yeah, exactly that it enables people to maybe access information they could have already accessed slightly easier and packaged in a nice way. But whether it has a material impact on effectiveness of the plot, I think is the one big gap. I actually am working a new project with Council of Europe where we're going to be looking at digital evidence in the Council of Europe area and whether in counterterrorism investigations they've had AI generated material propping up, how they found it, how they've interacted with it, whether they can use it in court cases, that type of thing. Because it just feels like it's a bit of a data blind spot at the moment of like anecdotal bits and bobs, but like that kind of we can say, oh, AI is just making people radicalize faster, it's targeting kids and whatever, but it's like, what's the evidence base for that? And so I think it's going to take time in terms of those specifics. But I agree at the moment, the idea of someone who couldn't have achieved something before AI suddenly achieving something or achieving something with more lethality or more effectiveness. I don't think I've seen an example of that.
Mhm. And this kind of goes back to your earlier point about the CBRN scenarios, right? So like this is probably the worst case scenario for the AI companies, and it's something that they're mindful of and they're fearful of in some ways, probably because there's a huge regulatory aspect that would kick in if AI starts being linked directly to a CBRN capability, particularly less on the non-state actor, but on the state actor, right? So like AI companies are putting a lot of effort in making sure that they don't become these like synthesized material for dangerous substance, right? So if you ask ChatGPT, how do I synthesize ricin, it'll probably tell you, well, no, I can't help you with this, right? But the reality is that information already exists, and it exists in scientific journal, it exists in online community, it exists in science fiction books. You can get extremely detailed description on how to do that. And I think what's different here is how people interact with that information. This is where like some stuff on communication theory becomes interesting, right? The difference between like relational and non-relational information exchange. So like the non-relational is the information goes one way. You're reading a book, right? You're absorbing the knowledge, but you can't ask follow-up questions. You can't ask clarification. That is it. Whereas if you're in a classroom setting, you can interrupt your teacher and you can ask, to clarify or to expand something like this. ChatGPT comes really close to this relational information exchange, right? Where somebody might get the denial. No, I can't tell you how to synthesize ricin. Okay, can you tell me which book describes ricin being synthesized? Oh, there you go, right? What are castor beans? Where do castor beans grow? Right? If it doesn't say that I think that might be where there's perhaps a value added, but that's not because we've got this highly sophisticated bad actor, which now has extra capabilities because we've got a kind of rudimentary actor who's now getting kind of a little top up.
Yeah, and just on that, I do wonder, because obviously we've moved to this space where we're, so focused on lone actors and, certainly in the kind of nihilist space and to extent the far right space, we've really just seen that copycat of like, well, someone's done this already. I'll just try and echo that and nod to different things. And so I do wonder whether ideation and kind of brainstorming, is one of the things that people say, oh, you should use, if you're stuck, you should use AI for brainstorming. That, lone actors, I guess, beyond being on the right channels and apps and being able to see what people have done before, like it allows for maybe more dynamic and a conversational, maybe this is something I could try. So I think you're right. I think there's some potential gains, as it were, for violent actors in that space, but it's hard to quantify, I guess.
Yeah, I'd say the gain is marginal, right? So like, the anti-Semite who asked ChatGPT, what's the nearest synagogue from my house? Well, okay, yeah, I mean, ChatGPT was used in that attack, I guess, in that attack planning, but he could have easily picked up a phone book, right? Um, so it's really whether the AI ends up being a central element that adds capability as opposed to just another tool that does the same thing, whether it's the phone book or a map or a pamphlet.
The reference to a phone book on a podcast about emerging tech is brilliant. Um, I mean, the way I've seen it used so far is in the propaganda space, right? And very limited in a way too, because I mean, you have these people from like groups like what's the one, Britain First, I think, on Twitter. Um, they'll have created images of this like lonely white girl on a subway surrounded by Somali immigrants, right? And so it's been interesting to see how it's being used, but it hasn't. We haven't seen any evidence, for example, of like getting AI to write manifestos for you, or create propaganda videos that are any good or of any great length. And so those are, I think, some of the things we'll probably see on the horizon, um, if not there are, if not already. Are you seeing any differences, I guess, with different ideological groups and how they've adopted it so far, in far left, far right, nationalist, separatist, jihadist, or is it all kind of too much in it, too early to say?
It was my time to go first. I thought it was Yannick's.
Oh, I'm happy for you to go, and
Whoever
I'll,
has
I'll
something
kick
to
in
say.
after. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think yeah, there's definitely sort of visibility bias. So yeah, it's certainly far right. There've been some very like obviously AI generated propaganda of the sort that you mentioned. There was it was last week, the sort of new far right political party in the UK, well, it has one MP. They've started releasing some music videos of a sort of far right rapper that's entirely AI generated. So I think that's kind of interesting because you're trying to engage with the cultural mainstream in a way, and obviously we've seen AI generated music and other things in the chart. So I think the far right aesthetic, and certainly seeing the US administration and their widespread use of AI in their comms strategy as well. So I can see there's like an affinity there, and obviously with the certain platforms leaning in that direction. But I don't know if it's as easy to say like this particular ideology favors. I know that ISIS and other Islamist groups have sort of discussed the appropriateness of using different models and different approaches, and there are potentially ideological barriers there for certain use cases. But I think because the ecosystem is so loose now, and the boundaries are a bit loose, it's a bit harder to say. I think these kind of official comms versus fanboys versus kind of supporters, that kind of thing. But yeah, Yannick, I mean, actually maybe just a finish, I think certainly on the left, I guess there is some of those kind of economic and structural factors that Yannick's already talked about in terms of the AI industry. I would have thought would be a barrier to widespread use of AI in their comms and propaganda, but who knows over time.
Yeah. So, like, my gut feeling here was to answer in a way that's very similar to what David said, and say essentially far right. We've seen how it's been used by creative adopter. There's the example of the British rapper, but also like even far right political party. So Alternative for Deutschland had this video that showed this kind of like orderly deportation or remigration of migrants, and but I also do wonder, and this is where I kind of want to caveat the answer far right, is how much of this is because that reflects essentially like our monitoring capability, right? Rather than actually like adoption pattern, right? So we're talking about largely Western platforms. We're talking about cases that are largely in English, French, German, so Western languages. We're talking about like Western facing network where the infrastructure to research AI is based. I'd be really interested to kind of hear what the disinformation kind of networks are amongst the diaspora community or in the global south or in other regions. And I think this is just the nature of terrorism research is that, the phenomena that we are seeing generally exist on a global scale. It's simply that we pay attention to what we are, what's closest to home, what happens in our own backyard, and the language that we understand. Um, So that's where I would just caveat the far right answer. I don't think it's wrong. That would be my assumption as well. But I do think it's important to kind of recognize that we're not really looking at the broader global harms within these communities.
I did want to end with kind of questions on, I think, where we are seeing very interesting adoption of this kind of technology, which is in war and conflict, right? And so we're seeing kind of them using it for logistics, using it for cyber warfare, using it for information warfare, kind of even command and control kind of decision making. What worries you most, I guess, about that trend on the battlefield? You know, we've seen it in Ukraine, we've seen it in Palestine, we've seen it in different contexts. Even if lone actors and extremist groups aren't using it, it seems like governments have already adopted it and incorporated pretty thoroughly.
Yeah, so I think really we've got two kind of laboratories there that we can kind of point to, right? The first one is the conflict in Ukraine with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is one of the places where the incorporation of particularly like consumer-based AI system is kind of widespread and is being documented, right? So we're seeing how consumer-based systems are being integrated into drone systems and to remote firing systems and whatnot. There's this great example, and the Ukrainians have the system they've incorporated into their drones that's able to essentially scan drone footage in order to detect and identify Russian equipment and Russian targets. And essentially, the idea here is just to increase the speed. And Don Razzler and I wrote a piece in the Sentinel last year about essentially, the change in how drones are being used in Ukraine. And one of the arguments we did is one of the vectors of change is speed. And this isn't only like the speed of the drone as far as like how fast it can fly, but rather the reaction speed where you're taking the human out of the equation, or you're subcontracting, if you will, part of the human task to an AI system. There's a lot of conversation happening about how it's being integrated, for example, by the Israeli military with systems like Lavender, but also more and more by the United States, and particularly within the context of the ongoing war in Iran. But again, these are not really the consumer-based AI system, right? Like these are the enterprise solutions that are still being manufactured by the same platforms, but they're, I would say, or at least I would assume, are inherently different than kind of the front-facing ChatGPT that we're seeing. And that's still quite opaque, at least to me. And I think we're starting to have these conversations, particularly with the Anthropic asking DoD not to use its system for mass surveillance or for autonomized targeting. At the end of the day, my thing is this: I don't let my students use AI for fear that it's going to make a mistake on a term paper, which at the end of the day is rather inconsequential to anything. I don't really want the same system making life or death decision, making targeting decision, and so on, right? So like if we as a society do not trust AI to give us the proper cook time on a roast, we probably shouldn't be using AI to decide what is a legitimate target and what isn't.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Lavender. I was reading a piece the other day which was sort of basically suggesting, that its primary role in that context had been just generating lists of targets, and in that context it was kind of individuals, and that the operator would have kind of 20 seconds to review the target before action was taken. And so I guess there's a broader question. I think this applies to AI writ large, but like in terms of that effectiveness question and accuracy question, if in the field of conflict that you're operating in, you're less concerned by the accuracy question, but you're looking for extra targets quickly, which is, by all accounts, what we're seeing in Iran at the moment, just a need for targets, then AI can be great at just generating lists and doing some of that background research and whatever. But again, to your point, Yannick, it's like, well, if the stakes are at the highest level they can be, which they are, which is life or death, then you would hope that the kind of role of the human operator and the human in the loop would be significant. But I think if you're just concerned about bombing as many different targets as possible, I can see it can play a useful role, even if if accuracy is not a thing. And I think broadly, I think this is the question for use of AI. Like, I don't necessarily believe these visions where it's going to be AGI and all these projected timelines, but it's just, if it's broadly good enough for what people want to use it for, it almost doesn't matter. So I think driverless cars are a great example where even if the safety record of a car is higher than the average human, thus far, most regulatory environments, the standard has to be way higher. But if you're just like, well, I'm just using it for a quick work email or a work report, and my threshold for accuracy or quality is like 70%, AI is great. And so when we start talking about life and death decisions, you would hope that your accuracy rating would have to be 100% and the level of review would be significant. But I think we're just seeing conflicts in which maybe that's not the threshold that people are operating to. And so it's been integrated in a way that is kind of good enough for the aims of or the strategic aims that it's being used for, rather than this necessarily all-knowing, all-powerful tool that is, more sophisticated and had more intelligence and kind of able to do things better. And I think, for me, that kind of the final thing is like the concept of human in the loop. That is kind of something we talk about all the time in the AI space. And you think, well, if you've got 20 seconds to review a target of a drone strike that's going to take that person's life, that's not meaningful human in the loop. And I think as these things scale and make more and more decisions, people can't really provide meaningful oversight. So I think for me, that's the kind of the big picture worry, that we have humans who are kind of there to maybe take responsibility for things, or the AI is there to say, well, it wasn't our fault, the AI made a mistake. But is there meaningful oversight? No, I'm not sure there is.
And I think one of the things that kind of falls into this is this kind of narrative that we need to get, everybody, any organization, any country needs to get onto this AI train, otherwise you're going to get left behind, right? If you look at like normal military procurement, it takes for absolutely ever to incorporate a new piece of gear within the arsenal of a Western country, right? Like, think about the F-35 debate, which is still ongoing in Canada. And yet, with AI system, I think because of this narrative of fast adoption being needed, this kind of like, let's go fast and break things, but also this kind of fear of competition of, if we don't incorporate AI into our defense systems really quickly, our adversaries are going to do it and they're going to get an upper hand. There's this kind of this risk of blind adoption. And if you start thinking about how rigorous it is to incorporate other piece of defense kit within the arsenal, why the exception? Why is it that accuracy, replicability doesn't matter nearly as much when it comes to AI systems?
So you're already seeing a kind of AI arms race then? Well, I mean, going back to something David said, which was interesting, this moral responsibility question, right? Is if it kind of makes me think of the trolley problem, in the sense of, does the AI make it so that you're one step removed from any like moral responsibility? Like, what are the psychological consequences of being a drone operator in this space where not only are you one step removed because you're behind a joystick, but now you're also behind another system that is making the decisions itself?
Yeah, I mean, I'm no psychologist, but and the bits that I've read over the years about the impacts of being a drone operator and doing all those things remotely, and that lack of connection, and the consequences of the decisions you're making, the actions you're taking is it's a very heavy weight. So I don't know whether from the human perspective it would be a net positive, but I guess against Yannick's point, like, our armies are just so bureaucratic, and decision-making processes, like you say, are not necessarily quick, but you generally will know that you have top cover and that decisions have been made by people more senior than you. And if it's an AI tool, I guess, like I say, I think it could be something that people can hide behind and say, well, if the tool made a mistake, that's not ultimately human's responsibility. So maybe the net effect for a human drone operator would be a positive one, because they wouldn't feel the responsibility. But it just feels like outsourcing that kind of decision making at this stage, to Yannick's point, is really terrifying, and is very much driven by this sense of competition. I mean, I think a very sort of sidebar comment, but I think it's fascinating at the moment with what's happening in the Gulf, and the impact that might have on AI, because basically the Gulf states are the ones who've been financing significant parts of this AI arms race on the US part in terms of all these massive data centers and whatever. And if their economies are hit, to what extent they'll be able to continue to do that is an open question too, I think.
And I think the other kind of aspect that comes in, right, is about the accuracy of the data going in, right? So we're often talking about these AI systems as being flawed and giving back bad information. But what we also know is that like AI systems, as they're being trained, often take on biases, particularly implicit biases, from that exist in the data, right? So not unlike when rules of engagement was, like any combatant is a male age 16 to 40. Um, you know, what is being used to train targeting system like Lavender? Uh, that I think, the technical side of, the AI platform becomes almost secondary to what's the data that's going into this, and what are the assumptions or the biases or the prejudice that are going to this data. Because at the end of the day, right, like these data systems are, particularly when we're talking on the military side, they're being deployed against people that, are speaking a different language, are very far removed from us, are in a different culture, are practicing a different religion. That worries me as well.
I think on that note, I think the takeaway from everything you guys have been saying is it's the jury's still out on how some of these things are going to make their way into terrorist groups or extremist groups, but there are kind of broader societal harms along the way that we need to be more mindful of. So thank you both for your time, but it's something to keep an eye on going forward for sure.
Yes.